If you walk through the streets of Washington, D.C. today, you will see monuments to the heroes of the Cold War. You will see the statue of Ronald Reagan standing tall in front of the Capitol. You will see memorials to the brave pilots who flew missions over Soviet territory and the diplomats who negotiated arms treaties. The story we tell ourselves about the end of the Cold War is a simple and triumphant one. We are taught that the Soviet Union collapsed because communism was an inferior system. We are taught that Reagan's military buildup forced the Soviets to spend themselves into oblivion. We are taught that the Berlin Wall fell because the people yearned for freedom and McDonald's. But there is a different version of this story. It is a version that you will not find in the textbooks of Harvard or Yale. It is a version that is whispered in the corridors of OPEC headquarters in Vienna and remembered with bitterness in the industrial cities of the Ural Mountains. In this version of the story, the Soviet Union did not fall because of missiles or speeches. It fell because of a conspiracy hatched in the deserts of Saudi Arabia. It fell because the United States and the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia engineered the greatest price collapse in the history of the oil market. They turned the commodity that was the lifeblood of the Soviet economy into a worthless river of poison. This is the story of the oil price hit. It is the story of how the Reagan administration weaponized the global energy market to strangle the Soviet state. It is the story of how a handshake between an American diplomat and a Saudi prince killed an empire without firing a single shot. It challenges the myth of the peaceful collapse and reveals the ruthless economic warfare that allowed the United States to win the Cold War not on the battlefield, but in the trading pits of the commodities exchanges. To understand this assassination, we have to look past the tanks and into the oil wells. In 1980, the Soviet Union was a superpower. It had the largest army in the world. It had nuclear weapons pointed at every major city in the West. It controlled Eastern Europe with an iron fist. The KGB operated in every capital on Earth. The red flag flew over 1/6 of the land surface of the planet. But the Soviet economy was a house of cards built on a foundation of black gold. The USSR was not an industrial giant despite what the propaganda posters showed. It was a petro-state. By the early 1980s, over 60% of Soviet hard currency earnings came from the export of oil and natural gas. The Soviet Union was more dependent on energy exports than Saudi Arabia. This was the Achilles heel that the Americans had been searching for. The Soviet system was grotesquely inefficient. The factories produced shoes that no one wanted to wear and tractors that broke down after one season. The collective farms could not feed the population. The only reason the Soviet Union could afford to import grain from the West, to subsidize its satellite states in Eastern Europe, and to fund its massive military was because of the rivers of crude oil flowing from the fields of Siberia. The price of oil in the late 1970s was sky high. In 1973, the Arab oil embargo had triggered a global energy crisis. The price of a barrel of crude shot up from $3 to over $12 almost overnight. Then in 1979, the Iranian Revolution caused another shock. Oil hit $40 a barrel. For the Soviet Union, this was an economic miracle. Their oil exports were suddenly worth a fortune. The Kremlin was awash in petrodollars. They used this windfall to embark on a series of disastrous adventures. They invaded Afghanistan in 1979. They armed communist insurgencies in Africa and Latin America. They built a new generation of nuclear missiles. The General Secretary Leonid Brezhnev and his successor Yuri Andropov believed that history was on their side. They believed that the capitalist West was in terminal decline and that high oil prices would fund the final victory of socialism. They were catastrophically wrong. In Washington, a new administration had taken power. Ronald Reagan was inaugurated as president in January 1981. He was a former actor and governor of California who had built his political career on a simple message. The Soviet Union was an evil empire and it had to be destroyed. Reagan's advisors were not content to simply contain the Soviets. They wanted to roll them back. They wanted to bankrupt them. The architect of this strategy was a man named William Casey. Casey was the director of the Central Intelligence Agency. He was a Wall Street lawyer who understood that money was the ultimate weapon. He had served in the Office of Strategic Services during World War II, where he learned that wars could be won with deception and financial manipulation as much as with bullets and bombs. Casey looked at the Soviet economy and he saw a target. He realized that if you could collapse the price of oil, you could collapse the Soviet Union. But how do you crash the price of a commodity that the entire world depends on? The answer lay in the deserts of the Arabian Peninsula. Saudi Arabia was the swing producer of the global oil market. It had massive reserves and the capacity to increase or decrease production at will. If Saudi Arabia opened the taps and flooded the market with cheap oil, the price would crater. But the Saudis had no reason to do this. High oil prices made them fabulously wealthy. The royal family was swimming in money. Why would they destroy their own income? This is where the conspiracy begins. The United States had to offer the Saudis something they wanted more than money. They had to offer them survival. The relationship between the United States and Saudi Arabia was one of the strangest alliances in history. It was a partnership between a democratic republic and an absolute monarchy. It was a friendship between a secular superpower and a fundamentalist theocracy. But it was built on a simple bargain that had been struck in 1945 when President Franklin Roosevelt met with King Abdul Aziz on a warship in the Suez Canal. The Americans would protect the Saudi regime from external threats. In return, the Saudis would sell their oil in dollars and reinvest their profits in American banks and weapons. By 1980, this relationship was under severe strain. The Saudis were terrified. The Iranian Revolution had just toppled the Shah, a monarch who had seemed invincible. The Ayatollah Khomeini was calling for the overthrow of all the royal families in the Middle East. He called the Saudi king a traitor to Islam. Iranian agents were fomenting unrest among the Shia minority in Saudi Arabia's eastern province, the very region where the oil fields were located. Even worse, the Soviet Union was on the march. In December 1979, Soviet tanks rolled into Afghanistan. Soviet forces were now less than 500 miles from the Saudi border. The Kremlin was arming left-wing governments in South Yemen and Ethiopia. The Saudis feared they were being encircled by hostile powers backed by Moscow. The nightmare scenario for the House of Sword was a Soviet-supported coup or an Iranian-backed revolution. They needed American protection more than ever, but they also needed something else. They needed advanced weapons that could defend their kingdom, and they needed America to help them fight back against the Soviet expansion. William Casey and his team at the CIA understood this desperation. They realized that the Saudis could be persuaded to sacrifice short-term oil revenue in exchange for long-term security guarantees. The Americans began to formulate a plan. It was elegant and ruthless. The United States would provide Saudi Arabia with the most sophisticated military equipment in the world. They would share intelligence on Soviet movements. They would help the Saudis fund a covert war against the Soviets in Afghanistan. But in return, the Saudis would agree to increase oil production and drive down the price. The beauty of this arrangement was its deniability. There would be no signed treaty. There would be no public announcement. It would be a gentleman's agreement between allies. If the Soviets accused the Saudis of economic warfare, the Saudis could simply say they were responding to market conditions. The negotiations were conducted in absolute secrecy. The key intermediary was a man named Prince Bandar bin Sultan. Bandar was the Saudi ambassador to the United States. He was young, charming, and ruthless. He had been educated at the Royal Air Force College in Britain and spoke perfect English. He was trusted by both the Saudi King Fahd and by Ronald Reagan. Bandar understood power. He once said that if you want to influence American policy, you have to go to bed with the United States. Not literally, he clarified, but you have to be so close that you understand how they think. Bandar became the secret channel between Riyadh and Washington. He held clandestine meetings with William Casey. They met in private estates in Virginia and in luxury hotels in Europe. The conversations were never recorded, but the outlines of the deal began to take shape. In 1985, the plan was ready to be executed. The Saudis had been gradually increasing their oil production over the previous years, but they had been doing so cautiously. They did not want to anger the other members of OPEC, the cartel of oil-producing nations. But in the summer of 1985, Saudi Arabia made a shocking decision. They announced that they would abandon their role as the swing producer who kept prices stable. Instead, they would pursue a policy of market share. They would pump as much oil as necessary to reclaim their position as the dominant force in the oil market. This was a declaration of economic war. The Saudi oil minister, Sheikh Ahmed Zaki Yamani, traveled to the other OPEC nations and told them the new reality. Saudi Arabia was going to flood the market. If you want to survive, you better cut your production. But the other OPEC nations did not cut production. They panicked. If Saudi Arabia was going to increase output, they needed to increase their own output to maintain their revenue. It was a classic race to the bottom. Within months, the global oil market was drowning in crude. The price began to fall. In January 1985, oil was trading at around $30 a barrel. By July, it had fallen to $25. By December, it was at $20, but the collapse was just beginning. In early 1986, the bottom fell out. The price of oil dropped to $15 a barrel, then $12, then $10. At its lowest point in the summer of 1986, oil traded for less than $8 a barrel. It was a price collapse of almost 70% in less than a year. It was the greatest destruction of wealth in the history of the energy market. For the Soviet Union, this was an economic apocalypse. The Kremlin had based its entire budget on an assumption that oil would trade at $25 to $30 a barrel. Now it was at $10. Hundreds of billions of dollars in expected revenue simply vanished. The Soviet finance ministry watched in horror as their foreign currency reserves evaporated. They could no longer afford to import the grain needed to feed the population. They could no longer subsidize the communist regimes in Eastern Europe. The Soviet satellite states in Poland, East Germany, and Hungary had been kept loyal through a combination of fear and money. The Kremlin provided them with cheap oil and gas, but now that subsidy was impossible to maintain. The economic crisis triggered political unrest across the Eastern Bloc. The Soviet military was hemorrhaging money. The generals had been promised new tanks, new aircraft, and new submarines, but there was no budget to pay for them. The soldiers in Afghanistan were running out of ammunition and fuel. The war that was supposed to be a quick victory had turned into a bloody quagmire, and now they could not even afford to supply their troops. The Communist Party elite, who had lived in luxury for decades, suddenly found that the state could not pay for their imported cars and their foreign vacations. The system was grinding to a halt. The Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev, who had come to power in March 1985, realized he was sitting on a ticking time bomb. He had inherited an economy that was fundamentally broken. The collapse of oil prices had exposed the rot at the core of the Soviet state. Gorbachev knew that he had to do something radical or the entire system would collapse. He launched two desperate reforms: glasnost, which meant openness, and perestroika, which meant restructuring. He hoped that by allowing more freedom of speech and by introducing limited market reforms, he could save the Soviet Union, but it was too late. The economic damage was irreversible. The Americans watched the crisis unfold with cold satisfaction. The plan was working even better than they had expected, but the CIA did not stop at the oil price war. They escalated. William Casey authorized a covert operation to make the Soviet economic crisis even worse. The CIA began to sabotage Soviet oil infrastructure. In one of the most daring acts of economic warfare in history, the CIA fed faulty technology to the Soviets. The KGB had been stealing Western technology for years. They had networks of spies who would acquire blueprints for advanced computer systems and industrial equipment. The CIA knew about these networks. Instead of shutting them down, they used them. The agency created a special program to provide deliberately flawed designs to the Soviet spies. The most devastating example of this program was the sabotage of the Soviet gas pipeline. In the early 1980s, the Soviets were building a massive natural gas pipeline from Siberia to Western Europe. It was a critical project. If completed, it would allow the USSR to earn billions of dollars in hard currency by selling gas to Germany and France. The pipeline required sophisticated control systems. The Soviets tried to buy the technology from the United States, but were blocked by export controls. So the KGB stole the plans. What the Soviets did not know was that the CIA had anticipated this theft. They had altered the software in the control systems. The sabotaged code worked perfectly during testing, but it had a hidden time bomb. After the pipeline became operational, the software would cause the pumps to run at pressures far beyond their safe limits. In the summer of 1982, American satellites detected a massive explosion in the Siberian wilderness. It was the largest non-nuclear explosion ever recorded. The sabotaged pipeline had detonated with a force equivalent to 3 kilotons of TNT. The flames could be seen from space. The explosion set back Soviet gas exports by years and cost them billions of dollars. The Soviets never realized it was sabotage. They thought it was an accident caused by their own incompetence. Meanwhile, the United States was waging economic war on another front. The Reagan administration launched a global campaign to block Soviet access to Western credit. In the 1970s, the Soviets had borrowed heavily from European banks. They used these loans to finance their military buildup and to import technology. But by the mid-1980s, the credit was drying up. The Americans pressured Western banks and governments to stop lending to Moscow. They argued that the Soviet economy was on the verge of collapse and that any loans would never be repaid. The campaign worked. By 1985, Soviet access to international credit markets was effectively cut off. They could not borrow money to cover their budget deficits. The financial noose was tightening. At the same time, the United States was driving up the cost of the arms race. Reagan announced the Strategic Defense Initiative, known as Star Wars. It was a plan to build a space-based missile defense system that could shoot down Soviet nuclear missiles. Most scientists believed the technology was decades away from being practical. Some believed it was impossible, but that did not matter. The announcement was a psychological operation designed to panic the Soviet military. The generals in Moscow looked at Star Wars and realized that if the Americans succeeded, the entire Soviet nuclear arsenal would be obsolete. They would have to spend hundreds of billions of dollars to develop countermeasures. But the Soviet economy was already on life support. They could not afford a new technological arms race. The genius of Star Wars was that it did not matter whether it worked. It only mattered that the Soviets believed it might work. They were forced to divert scarce resources to develop responses to a weapon that did not yet exist. By 1986, the Soviet Union was in a state of financial collapse. The government was running massive deficits. Inflation was spiraling out of control. Store shelves were empty. People stood in line for hours to buy bread and toilet paper. The black market was booming because the official economy had ceased to function. The Soviet people were losing faith in the system. For 70 years, the Communist Party had promised that socialism would deliver prosperity and equality. But now even the most loyal party members could see that the system was a failure. The lies were becoming impossible to maintain. In Eastern Europe, the unrest was reaching a boiling point. In Poland, the Solidarity movement was organizing strikes and protests. In Hungary, reformers were demanding political change. In East Germany, people were fleeing to the west through Hungary and Czechoslovakia. The Berlin Wall that had been the ultimate symbol of Soviet power was becoming porous. The Kremlin faced a terrible choice. They could use military force to crush the rebellions as they had done in Hungary in 1956 and Czechoslovakia in 1968. But military intervention was expensive, and the Soviet army was already overstretched in Afghanistan. More importantly, Gorbachev understood that using tanks to suppress the people of Eastern Europe would destroy any hope of improving relations with the West. The Soviets desperately needed Western loans and technology to save their economy. If they crushed the protests, they would be isolated and sanctioned. Gorbachev made the fateful decision to let the protests continue. He announced that the Soviet Union would not intervene to prop up the communist regimes in Eastern Europe. It was an admission of weakness. And once the people of Eastern Europe realized that Soviet tanks would not come, the floodgates opened. In the summer of 1989, the Berlin Wall fell. Crowds of East Germans poured through the checkpoints and tore down the concrete barrier with hammers and bare hands. It was a moment of euphoria that was broadcast around the world. In the United States, the fall of the wall was celebrated as a triumph of freedom over tyranny. President George H.W. Bush, who had succeeded Reagan, declared a new world order. But the celebration in Washington was premature. The most dangerous moment was yet to come. The Soviet Union itself was beginning to disintegrate. By 1990, the Baltic states of Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania were demanding independence. Soviet republics in Central Asia and the Caucasus were declaring sovereignty. The centrifugal forces were ripping the empire apart. In Moscow, hardliners in the Communist Party and the military were furious. They believed that Gorbachev had betrayed the revolution. They believed that the Soviet Union could still be saved if they used force to restore order. In August 1991, a group of conservative officials launched a coup. They placed Gorbachev under house arrest at his vacation home in Crimea. They declared a state of emergency. Tanks rolled into the streets of Moscow. For a moment, it looked like the Soviet Union might be saved by a return to Stalinist repression. But the coup failed. The soldiers refused to fire on the crowds. Boris Yeltsin, the president of the Russian Republic, stood on top of a tank and rallied the people to resist. The coup collapsed within 3 days. Gorbachev returned to Moscow, but his authority was shattered. Within months, the Soviet Union officially dissolved. On December 26, 1991, the red flag was lowered from the Kremlin for the last time. The Soviet Union ceased to exist. 15 independent nations emerged from the wreckage. The Cold War was over. In Washington, the victory was celebrated as a vindication of American values. But the question of what really killed the Soviet Union became a matter of fierce debate. Historians pointed to a dozen different causes. Some said it was the inherent inefficiency of the command economy. Some said it was the failure of communism to deliver consumer goods. Some said it was the information revolution that made it impossible for the Soviet state to control the flow of ideas. All of these factors played a role. But the role of the oil price collapse has been systematically downplayed. The reason is simple. If you acknowledge that the United States and Saudi Arabia conspired to bankrupt the Soviet Union through market manipulation, you have to acknowledge that the end of the Cold War was not a peaceful triumph of democracy. It was the result of ruthless economic warfare. It was a hit job. The Saudi role in the conspiracy has always been controversial. In the years after the Soviet collapse, Sheikh Yamani, the Saudi oil minister who oversaw the production increase, gave a series of interviews. He was asked whether the decision to flood the market was coordinated with the United States. Yamani was careful in his answers. He said that Saudi Arabia acted in its own interest, but he also admitted that there were consultations with Washington. He said that the United States made it clear that they wanted lower oil prices, and he said that the Saudis understood that by hurting the Soviet Union, they were helping themselves. In 1986, King Fahd fired Yamani. The official reason was a policy disagreement, but many observers believe that Yamani was removed because he knew too much about the secret deal. He had become a liability. Yamani lived the rest of his life in exile in London. He died in 2021, having never fully disclosed the extent of the conspiracy. The economic devastation caused by the oil price collapse is still visible in Russia today. The collapse of the Soviet Union was not a smooth transition to democracy and capitalism. It was a catastrophic implosion that led to the greatest peacetime economic collapse in modern history. In the 1990s, Russian GDP fell by over 40%. Life expectancy dropped. The middle class was wiped out. A small group of oligarchs looted the state assets. They bought oil fields and factories for pennies on the dollar. The social contract was shattered. Millions of Russians who had lived under the security of the Soviet system suddenly found themselves in a chaotic free-for-all. The humiliation of this period shaped the worldview of an entire generation of Russians. One of those Russians was a young KGB officer named Vladimir Putin. Putin was stationed in Dresden, East Germany, when the Berlin Wall fell. He watched as the crowd stormed the secret police headquarters. He called Moscow for instructions and was told that Moscow was silent. He later said that was the moment he realized the Soviet Union was finished. Putin returned to Russia and witnessed the chaos of the 1990s. He watched as the country was humiliated by the West. He watched as NATO expanded eastward, absorbing the former Soviet satellite states. He watched as Western economists dictated Russian economic policy. He developed a deep resentment of the United States. When Putin came to power in 1999, he vowed to restore Russia's strength. He rebuilt the military. He centralized power. He used Russia's oil and gas exports as a weapon to coerce his neighbors. He invaded Georgia in 2008 and Ukraine in 2014. He interfered in Western elections. He positioned Russia as a rival to American hegemony. Many of Putin's actions can be traced back to the trauma of the Soviet collapse. He believes that the United States destroyed the Soviet Union through underhanded means. He believes that the West cannot be trusted, and he is determined to ensure that Russia is never again vulnerable to economic strangulation. The legacy of the oil price hit also transformed the Middle East. Saudi Arabia's decision to crash oil prices in the 1980s had long-term consequences for its own economy. The kingdom went from being flush with cash to running massive budget deficits. They had to cut subsidies and reduce government spending. The economic strain contributed to the rise of extremism. Young Saudis who could no longer find jobs became radicalized. Some joined militant groups. One of those young men was Osama bin Laden. Bin Laden had fought in Afghanistan during the Soviet occupation. He was part of the Mujahideen, the Islamic fighters who were armed and funded by the United States and Saudi Arabia as part of the covert war against the Soviets. When the Soviets withdrew from Afghanistan in 1989, bin Laden returned to Saudi Arabia as a war hero. But he became disillusioned with the Saudi royal family. He was enraged when King Fahd allowed American troops to be stationed in Saudi Arabia during the Gulf War in 1990. Bin Laden viewed the presence of non-Muslim soldiers on sacred Arabian soil as a desecration. He turned against the Saudi regime and the United States. He formed Al-Qaeda and launched a campaign of terror that culminated in the attacks of September 11, 2001. In a twisted sense, the covert alliance between the United States and Saudi Arabia that destroyed the Soviet Union also planted the seeds of the war on terror. The Mujahideen who were armed to fight the Soviets became the Taliban and Al-Qaeda. The economic desperation caused by low oil prices contributed to radicalization across the Muslim world. The oil price hit achieved its immediate goal. It bankrupted the Soviet Union, but it created a new set of enemies that would haunt the United States for decades. The story of the oil price conspiracy also reveals the limits of economic warfare. The United States and Saudi Arabia were able to destroy the Soviet Union because they controlled a vital commodity. But that power was temporary. Today, the global oil market is very different. The United States is now the world's largest oil producer thanks to the shale revolution. Russia has rebuilt its economy and is once again a major energy exporter. China has emerged as the dominant economic power in the world. The days when the United States and Saudi Arabia could dictate global oil prices are over. The lesson of the Soviet collapse is that economic power is the ultimate weapon in the modern world. Wars are no longer won by conquering territory. They are won by controlling resources, manipulating currencies, and strangling your enemy's access to capital. The Cold War was supposed to have ended with the triumph of democracy and free markets, but the reality is that it ended with a financial assassination. The Soviet Union was not defeated in a fair fight. It was lured into a trap. It was bled dry by an arms race it could not afford, and then finished off by an oil price collapse that was engineered by its enemies. The concrete certainty that the Soviet Union was invincible was shattered not by military force, but by a handshake